Israel has the right to defend itself.
There has not been a significant overreaction.
The United States must acknowledge its role in the injustice and human rights violations of Palestinians. This is not about both sides.
Mounting calls in Congress for President Biden to put pressure on Netanyahu to stop Israel's military assault on Gaza. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Ghida Fakhry. As Israel continues its military assault on Gaza, President Biden has reiterated his, quote, firm support for Israel's right to defend itself against indiscriminate rocket attacks, unquote. As the civilian death toll rises, the Biden administration is facing mounting pressure at home and abroad to take decisive action to end Israel's military campaign. For the third time, the United States blocked a UN Security Council statement which would have called for a ceasefire.
With regard to the United Nations, we're not standing in the way of diplomacy. On the contrary, as I said, we're exercising it virtually nonstop.
Meanwhile, 29 of the 50 Democratic senators, including staunch supporters of Israel, issued a joint statement urging an immediate ceasefire to prevent any further loss of civilian life and to prevent further escalation of conflict. Two senators on the Committee on Foreign Relations issued the first bipartisan call for cessation of hostilities. And while some Democratic lawmakers want military aid to Israel conditioned, the Biden administration has approved a $735 million weapons sale to Israel, which still has to be ratified by Congress. The chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee is now calling for a congressional review of the arms sale. But with 75% of House members recently expressing their support for continued military assistance to Israel without preconditions, the sale is likely to go through. So is the tide really shifting, or will it be business as usual? In a few moments, we'll speak with Pink Floyd's Roger Waters, the famed musician and longtime peace activist. But first, I'm joined by former U.S. Democratic Congressman Jim Moran, who served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1991 to 2015. Congressman Moran, you served 12 terms in the U.S. Congress. You've seen many of these cycles of violence between Israelis and Palestinians and the way several U.S. presidents have dealt with them. What is the end game here? How long will the U.S. government, the Biden administration, and Congress continue to stand by, watching and supporting Israel diplomatically, financially, and militarily?
Part of the problem, Ghida, is that there is no end game. There is no strategy. Bibi Netanyahu has tactics, but he doesn't have any strategy other than a personal political agenda to maintain his grip over Israeli society and really over American politics.
So what is Biden's calculus then?
Joe Biden was hoping to pivot from the Middle East, which he considered to be something of a quagmire, both militarily and politically, to dealing with what he would call the great powers, China and Russia, so that the United States could deal with the economic issues and create a more stable relationship, both with our allies and our adversaries. But that's not going to work until we resolve some of these intractable issues in the Middle East. Unfortunately, almost every time the United States intervenes, it's been poorly thought out without an exit strategy.
Well, he's trying the hands-off approach, but not quite. He's also showing his continuing explicit support for Israel. He has just approved the sale of $735 million in arms to Israel. What message does this decision send at a time like this?
It sends the wrong message. The United States has no business providing on May 5th, while this violence was going on, missiles that are designed to directly attack their specific target. They're not like the things that the Hamas and some of the Palestinians are sending, which result in very few fatalities. These are directly targeted on buildings, on organizations, and on individuals. And the collateral damage of civilian deaths, and that's been over 200, seems to be of little concern. What should be of concern to the United States is that these are our weapons that Israel is using to kill innocent civilians. And we had no business going forward with that arms sale. Unfortunately, a number of members of the House and Senate have objected to doing that.
But what are the chances that any of this will change? Because when you compare the situation and the politics today to 30 years ago, 1991, when you became a congressman and George H.W. Bush was in office, he threatened to delay loan guarantees to Israel until it stopped its settlement expansion and resettlement of Soviet Jews in Israel. Joe Biden, 30 years later, has just approved the sale of yet more weapons, oblivious to how these weapons are being used, as you say, against schools and hospitals, media offices, basic civilian infrastructure. Where is America's political leverage? Where is its moral standing?
Well, we have loads of political leverage if we chose to use it. Moral standing is another issue entirely. I strongly support Joe Biden for many reasons, and I know him and like him as a friend. His response to this violence is disappointing. And frankly, I think President Obama would have reacted somewhat differently. Bibi Netanyahu should not be holding all of the cards on this, and the United States being deferential to Mr. Netanyahu, who did everything he could to defeat both President Obama and, by implication, Vice President Biden. Joe Biden knows that Bibi Netanyahu is not a supporter, but I do think domestic politics is invariably a consideration in the United States. Now, you have more than half of the Democratic senators urging the United States to call for a ceasefire, and a good many Democratic House members. That is progress. No Republicans have called for a ceasefire. In fact, Republicans are going to bring a resolution to the floor of the Senate to show support for Israel.
Is it a real shift, though? Is there a real shift within the Democratic Party on Israel, a real shift on Capitol Hill?
I would curb our enthusiasm for a real shift on Capitol Hill. I think there are people willing to stand up and speak out, but I think the people throughout the United States who care about this are far more interested in securing peace and giving some consideration to the suffering of the Palestinians than are the U.S. Congress. Palestinians and the Arab communities generally have much less political influence in the United States than they should, or that people on the other side do. But there are a lot of enlightened Jewish constituents, if you will, who have been speaking out and who have a strong voice, a thoughtful voice. John Ossoff, for example, is Jewish, and he led the effort to get 28 US senators calling for a ceasefire. Of course, the United States never should have blocked calls for the ceasefire at the United Nations. That was wrong. It was inconsistent with American values. It was disappointing.
But will any of these statements and tweets make any real difference? Will they affect change when it comes to policy?
Only because I've been involved in this for so long, am I as pessimistic as I am. I don't see where we're going to go with this. There is no hope really for a two-state solution. There's not enough land left for there to be a viable Palestinian state. And of course, Israel will insist not only that it control the levers of its economy, but also the levers of its security. So I don't think that that Palestine, as it was once envisioned, is a viable solution. I'm afraid that what's going to happen is a one-state solution, and probably some semblance of a civil war. I want to underscore this, Ghida, if I could. This is different than prior conflicts because that 20% of the Israeli population that is Arab is now very much engaged in this. So you have conflicts breaking out throughout Israel, inside its borders, in addition to the conflict with Hamas. And you also have Egypt, Jordan, and even some of the Arab states that signed on to the Abraham Accord saying, we can't tolerate this. This is not going down well with the Arab street, as it's referred to, and it's wrong.
But what about the situation here in the US, Congressman? When you have people like Bernie Sanders coming out, one of the most vocal critics of Netanyahu's policy, and saying, quote, that the devastation in Gaza is unconscionable. We must urge an immediate ceasefire. The killing of Palestinians and Israelis must end. We must also take a hard look at nearly $4 billion a year in military aid to Israel. It is illegal for US aid to support human rights violations. Sanders raises the issue of the legality of these Israeli airstrikes, and he isn't the only one in Congress. Others have too. Now, as a former member of the House Appropriations Committee, is there any chance Congress would rethink its military assistance to Israel, or will it continue to be a blank check, essentially?
There is no chance that that is going to be substantially changed. It's close to $4 billion now, particularly if you include the intelligence assistance. Egypt's aid is dependent upon Israel's aid, and part of our military-industrial complex, which sells weaponry to Israel, is dependent upon that money being made available.
But so to what extent then?
At the beginning of the year, unlike anything else, it's the majority of our foreign aid.
To what extent does the US then become complicit, if it hasn't already?
There certainly is complicity in what Israel has been empowered to do toward the Palestinian population. But we don't accept responsibility for the most part. Some speak out. Bernie Sanders is right on this issue. Others in the House are right, but they don't represent the majority of 100 senators or 435 members of Congress. The most active political force in the United States, if you look at ethnicities, is the American Jewish population, which is more engaged politically and financially than any other. But it's not just the Jewish community, the evangelical Christian community who believes that someday everybody is going to come to Jerusalem, and then those who accept Jesus as their savior will survive and everybody else will perish. Obviously Israel doesn't believe any of that nonsense, but they're using it politically, and they're using it to their advantage. So politically, the opposition to what Bernie Sanders is suggesting is very strong, and I don't see it particularly diminishing.
What about the strength of the pro-Israel lobby today? One of your colleagues in Congress back in the day, Republican Congressman Paul Findley, documented the extent to which the pro-Israel lobby influenced congressional, senatorial, and presidential elections in his famous book, They Dare to Speak Out. How much of a sea change are you seeing today in the willingness of some to be critical of Israel when you compare it to what it was like for you and others to speak up 10, 20, or even 30 years ago?
There's a minor shift in the coastline. The current has not changed. Paul Findley was subjected to enormous criticism and particularly political issues because he spoke his mind, and others did too, but they were in a minority. And unfortunately, they're in a minority today. But all that people can do is to speak up for what they believe to be the right thing. And hopefully, the American public will become sufficiently educated on what's going on that they will insist that their politicians follow their desires and do the right thing.
For now, though, former Congressman Jim Moran, thank you very much for joining me and sharing your perspective. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you for focusing on this very important issue. I appreciate your concern and the professionalism of your reporting. Thank you very much.
Over the last few days, tens of thousands of people across several US cities and states have marched in solidarity with Palestinians demanding an end to Israeli airstrikes. A growing number of celebrities, musicians, and professional athletes have added their voice to demands for accountability and justice for Palestinians. Joining me now is Roger Waters, the co-founder of the legendary progressive rock band, the Pink Floyd. Waters has long been a peace advocate and supporter of Palestinian rights. Roger Waters, great to have you on the program. You've described what has been happening to Palestinians as, quote, unconscionable, saying it makes you angry, that it breaks your heart. You're one of the very first, and still one of the few, to have used consistently your fame and huge influence for years to lobby for change. We just heard what some politicians here in the US are up against. Are artists facing similar pressures to remain silent, or are you seeing any significant change?
In terms of how people are treated who speak up about Palestine and its indigenous people and how appallingly they've been treated by the Zionist experiment, no, I'm not seeing any real change at all. I'm seeing a change in the whole general way of looking at it, though. It has changed a lot since I got involved. I haven't been involved for very long. I didn't really get involved until 2006. Okay, so that's only 15 years, which is a heartbeat. We have to remember that the occupation has been going on for 70 years. You know, it's a long time since 1948. And so we, the people, but particularly the indigenous people of Palestine, have had 70 years to watch this experiment in settler colonialism fail. We are seeing its dying breaths, I hope, because it's clearly a failed experiment, because it's miserable for everyone involved. It's miserable for the Israelis, it's miserable for the Palestinians, more miserable, obviously, for the Palestinians, because they have been occupied for 70 years, both in the state of Israel and in the occupied territories.
No, well, no, you've spoken out, but some others in the industry are also trying to speak up. Many human rights defenders and Palestinian peace activists, though, have long complained about, quote unquote, this cancel culture, especially when it comes to Palestinian rights. There have been several recent examples of artists, singers, footballers, and other celebrities facing pressure and backlash for just retweeting or posting any messages of support or just empathy for Palestinian women and children weeping in front of their bombed homes.
I know
and
that.
schools. How do you fight that?
I'll tell you two things right now. One is that when I finish with you here, I'm going to get on with this story, which is that Riyad Mahrez, who plays for Manchester City, Mohamed El Neni, who plays for my team, Arsenal, Hamza Chowdhury, who plays for Leicester City, Benjamin Mendy, who's a Man City player, Mo Salah, who famously plays for Liverpool, and Anad Diallo, who played for Manchester United. There are 7 English Premier League players who've come out in support of Palestine. And not all of them, but certainly my guy, El Neni, is facing pushback for the club that he works for. So that's one thing. I'll tell you one other thing, a very small, quick story. Years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I had an email exchange with little Stephen Van Zandt. He's a good, great musician. And he was in the E Street band with Bruce Springsteen. But he also produced We Will Not Sing in Sun City back in the day. So I wrote to him and said, hey, why don't we rearrange that for We Won't Sing in Tel Aviv? Okay, it's about time that we raised our voices. And he wrote me a lovely email back saying, you know, your career could be over in a heartbeat, don't you? You shouldn't even mention that issue or whatever. So, Stephen, I hope you're beginning to come round, my friend. But I understand your fear, because he's quite right. It's a dangerous place to be, standing on this parapet, next to me and Gil Scott Heron and all the others who've stood up. And it still is, probably, because the propaganda machine is so powerful that the general public is so ill-educated. And so are my musician colleagues. They know nothing really about it if they've grown up in it.
And yet some of them did decide to actually boycott Israel and
have.
did cancel some of their appearances in
They
Israel. Are they facing a lot of pushback?
You would have
Is there a
to ask
significant
Lauren
cost?
Hill or the others who actually did, And when I don't mention all their names, it's because I can't remember long lists of names, A, and B, it is not a very long list. There's maybe 20 names on it. So, yes, we are in a tiny minority of people who care enough about the indigenous people of that bit of the Middle East to stand up for their simple, basic human rights. Sorry.
How much can celebrities, though, help change the narrative? You mentioned Sun City. You mentioned Pink Floyd cancelling an appearance in South Africa 30 years ago, helping bring down the system of apartheid there with boycotts, by refusing to perform in the country until apartheid fell and Black people enjoyed equal rights. We all grew up listening to some of the powerful music and lyrics that you wrote with Pink Floyd in the album The Wall. You went to the West Bank, and I believe you spray painted the lyrics to this song on the wall. In South Africa, it became adopted, the song did, as a bit of a national anthem. It was banned in that country. It resonated with Palestinian children who have sang their own version. We don't need no occupation, they say. But has anything fundamentally changed for Palestinians, would you say, since 2006, when you got involved?
A lot more people where I live know a lot more about their predicament. When I started in 2000, for instance, here's one very simple thing. Until 5 years ago, you could not use the word apartheid. Now, after following B'Tselem's lead, B'Tselem, as you know, is the major human rights organization in Israel itself. Following their lead, Human Rights Watch 2 weeks ago came out and declared that Israel officially, they've done all the research, is an apartheid state. Apartheid and racism. You literally couldn't say that without people saying, why don't you take Roger away and lock him up in a quiet cell somewhere? Or better still, put him up against a wall and shoot him because he's obviously criminally insane. Well, now they don't even deny it. Have you heard a great deal with the Israelis wanting to engage in a conversation about the meaning of the word apartheid and whether or not their state subscribes to that ethos? No, you haven't, because they know they haven't got a single leg to stand on. So things have changed a lot, which is why Netanyahu's position now is, we're going to kill everybody. And when we've killed everybody, we're going to kill them again. They're going to learn how powerful we are. Look at this fighter jet behind me. We can kill you whenever we want, wherever we want. And we want all the neighbors to know that we can as well. We are powerful. We are Israel. We can beat you up. Fuck you prick. But that's his stance. That is his version of diplomacy.
I think you're absolutely right. The narrative in this country, in the United States, has changed. You would never hear a few years ago words like apartheid being used in mainstream media or in the US Congress. But our people around you, our celebrities, those who can actually influence a lot of people, are they waking up to the plight of Palestinians?
Sorry, just a minute. Oi! All you celebrities up here in my room. There aren't any. I don't know celebrities. I mean, I was in court yesterday supporting my friend Stephen Donsker, who's a human rights lawyer who's representing 30,000 indigenous, Amazon dwellers from Ecuador in a fight against Chevron. Susan Sarandon was there making a speech at my side. But Susan Sarandon and I don't know her. I've never met her socially. I will now, because now we've met, and I know she lives in New York. But I don't run into celebrities. I have nothing. I've no idea where I would meet such a thing. You know.
All right, but what about the role that, we won't use the word celebrities, but what about the role that artists like you can play? 50 years ago, George Harrison of the Beatles organized a benefit concert for Bangladesh. Would you consider doing one for Palestine?
And let's not forget my friend Bob Geldof, that old Irish chap, you know, and Live Aid
yes.
and all of that. And then Live Aid, where he famously persuaded me to persuade Gilmore that we should play on stage once more together, which is great. Yeah, those people who organize things, I take my hat off to them, and I do think they're important. Are we ready for the concert for Palestine? Maybe. Obviously, people like Omar Barghouti and all my friends in the BDS movement and now, if you were to ask me about friends in this movement, yeah, I have thousands of them, you know, and I'm very close to a lot of them. As celebrities, not so much. Are we nearly ready for that concert? I think we are. Over the years, I've said, you know what? We're not ready for it. I'm not going to get involved in a damp squib, but if we did it, starting to think about doing it now for when we're allowed to have a crowd of people together, I believe it's possible now that we might be able to go into Central Park and have 400,000 people there, all waving Palestinian flags and all joining the choir and all shouting with one voice. Do you want to live in a world where we all act collectively under the law to work with and for our brothers and sisters, to exchange our love and goodwill with one another, and to cooperate with the possibility that eventually we might develop enough cooperation to save this poor, maligned, wounded planet from the Benjamin Netanyahus and Joe Bidens of this world, to save it for our children and grandchildren, and from Chevron and from Coca-Cola and for all the big corporations and from Jeff Bezos and from Mark Zuckerberg and from Bill Gates and all those people who work against the possibility of this planet remaining habitable for the Palestinians as well as for us. I think that may be more of a possibility than it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago, yeah. In fact, maybe I'll do it. I'll try to.
When you do have a date in mind, let us know, and I hope we'll get the chance to speak with you again. But for now, though, Roger Waters, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate talking to you.
Thank you for having me on. I'm sorry we had to go into bleep land a bit. Well, I'm not.
As long as the message from Washington is that our military support for Israel is unconditional, Netanyahu's extremism, right-wing government will continue to expand settlements, continue to demolish homes, and continue to make the prospects for peace impossible.
The question at hand is, should our taxpayer dollars create conditions for justice, healing, and repair? Or should those dollars create conditions for oppression and apartheid?
Can progressive lawmakers, grassroots activism, pressure by pro-Israel groups, and a slight shift in mainstream US media coverage of the crisis bring enough pressure to bear on the Biden administration to recalibrate America's traditional unconditional support of Israel? I'm joined now by Ambassador Alan Solomon. He is Vice Chair of J Street, a pro-Israel advocacy group that represents pro-peace Americans. Ambassador Solomon, Israel is losing some support in the US Congress. Even its most ardent supporters are voicing concern about its punishing attacks on Palestinians. Dozens of children have already been killed. Should the Biden administration continue to support Israel blindly, regardless of its policies, its human rights record, its military actions?
No, of course it shouldn't support Israel blindly. The United States has its own interests. It has an interest actually in Israel's security. And if you believe that the actions of the Israeli government are not in the interests of Israel's ongoing security, then one would be concerned about that. The United States has an interest in humanitarian values. And when it sees that more than 200 residents of Gaza have been killed and many women and children, or that fact of the matter is that 10 Israelis have been killed and many injured. That is not a good situation or a sustainable situation. I think the Biden administration ought to stand up and do everything it can to stop the violence and to lean on its important ally in the region to de-escalate immediately.
Well, it clearly isn't doing this. It has expressed its support for a ceasefire. It hasn't demanded a ceasefire. It hasn't leaned on Israel in any way. At what point do organizations like yours that say they support peace demand a different, more balanced U.S. approach?
Well, that has been the mission of J Street from its founding. That was our message during the Trump years, and that's certainly our message to the Biden administration. The difference is, I think we have people in the Biden administration who understand the situation, who listen to us, but they're not doing enough, and we've been very outspoken on that score and have been telling them both privately and publicly that this administration and our government has to do more and has to demand an immediate ceasefire, has to use its leverage on the Israelis, both for the sake of the current conflagration, but also for some of the underlying reasons for why things have gotten so bad. You know, President Trump gave Israel a blank check to expand settlements, to establish what is de facto annexation in some respects, and that has to be called out for what it was, and those policies have to be reversed.
But that isn't what you are calling for. You have been vocal against the expansion of settlements, but you haven't asked for Israel to withdraw its current settlements. How do you achieve peace if you aren't willing to call Israel out on some of its policies?
I'm not sure that's entirely accurate. And I mean, J Street believes that in a two-state solution, that the only way to get to that point is for the parties to negotiate. We also realize that that's not a realistic goal right now. And I think the first step is to stop the situation from getting worse, to establish closer ties again with the Palestinians. You know, some of the actions that we have called for is to reopen the consulate in East Jerusalem, to allow the Palestinian Authority to reopen its office in Washington. These are both steps that President Trump had taken to close both of those. It is a good thing that the Biden administration has restored humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, but it has to do more than that. We think it should actually appoint a special envoy to be concerned about the situation between Israel and Palestine.
Well, this is what you say in, not you personally, but what J Street says in its latest statement. In addition to everything you just mentioned, it says, as well as officially making clear that the US government considers settlement expansion and de facto annexation to be illegal under international law. What about existing settlements?
I think J Street has been pretty clear that we believe that the existing settlements violate international law. Fact is, we need to stop the expansion to begin with, and establish a calm and a different relationship between the parties. You know, this is not a situation where a two-state solution is imminent. I think the first thing you do is stop the harm and do no further harm. But J Street has been very explicit about our belief and our belief that the settlements do violate international law.
And on the situation on the ground today, you and others tend to couch this in a both sides narrative. Doesn't it obscure the reality? If you're going to talk about both sides, shouldn't you be willing to hold Israel accountable? It's an occupying power that has violated countless international law, resolutions of the UN for decades. Yet J Street's statement just this week did not condemn Israeli actions in East Jerusalem or Gaza, but it did, quote, unequivocally and strongly condemn Hamas's rocket fire.
Well, that's not true. We have condemned the Israeli government behavior in in attempting to evict Palestinians from their homes, in police presence at the Damascus gate.
There was no condemnation, Ambassador. There were two expressions of condemnation for Hamas, but J Street says that the US, quote, should publicly inform the Israeli government that intensive airstrikes on heavily populated areas must immediately stop. Publicly inform. Was that an oversight or a deliberate attempt to pin the blame just on one side?
Let me read to you from our latest statement. It is now over a week since incendiary efforts to dispossess Palestinian families in East Jerusalem and aggressive Israeli police action on the Temple Mount helped to spark an explosive escalation in violence between Israel, Hamas, and other Palestinian militant groups. The fact of the matter is...
But that is the statement I'm looking at. You talk about aggressive Israeli actions. You do not condemn these actions.
Ghida, let me finish. There's no question that the extremists on both sides are strengthening the hands of the extremists on the other side. Hamas is a terrorist organization. It is raining missiles down on civilian populations in Israel, and that is unacceptable. However, there's no question that Israel had a great deal to do with sparking the current situation. One of the things that we call for is the United States to use its efforts to deal with some of the underlying causes that have gotten out of control. And that has to do with settlements. And that has to do with the treatment of Palestinians. And for that matter, that has to do with treatment of Arab Israelis. So I don't think your characterization of where J Street's coming from is at all accurate.
Well, I was reading from that very same statement, Ambassador, but talking about Hamas, the US and other Western countries label Hamas as a terrorist organization. These labels are political in nature, we all know. This being said, though, Hamas and other Palestinian resistance movements are bound by international law, but so is Israel. Do you condemn Israel's disproportionate use of force against civilians?
I do, yes. Yes,
how is it defending itself by attacking schools, hospitals, roads, and other basic civilian infrastructure? The vast majority of its victims are civilian.
Mm-hmm. Well, I said I do condemn the disproportionate response, but both sides have to de-escalate. This isn't something that one side is going to be able to stop by itself. We understand that Hamas has an interest in stopping this. Certainly, the biggest victims are the residents of Gaza. I mean, they are being harmed by their own leadership, and we do understand that Hamas has an interest in trying to halt this. That Israel has actually resisted that. I don't know.
But hold on, Ambassador. But it is Israel that is pounding areas in Gaza with sophisticated weaponry. They are targeting schools and refugee camps and the like under the guise of attacking military targets without presenting any evidence. What Israel is effectively doing is terrorizing an entire besieged population. At best, it's collective punishment. It's a war crime.
Mm-hmm. Well,
where's the outrage? What is being done about that?
Well, I think there is outrage, but I think there's outrage directed at both. I think that the actions of the Israeli government and, frankly, the history of the Trump administration basically giving Israel a blank check to behave however it wishes and in ways that we think are not only not consistent with American interests, but not even consistent with Israel's interests, frankly. John Kerry was the one that said that the situation is unsustainable. But at the same time, when rockets are being sent over to civilian, thousands of rockets are being aimed at civilian targets in Israel, we do believe that Israel has a right to defend itself from that.
What about Palestinians, though? What about Palestinians?
At the same time,
do they have the same right to defend themselves?
Yes. At the same time that we believe that Israel's actions are unacceptable. So one can hold both of those views at the same time, Ghida.
Ambassador Alan Solomon, founding board member of J Street, vice chair, and soon to be the chair of the board. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you, Ghida. I appreciate it.
Now, one of the grassroots organizations in the United States long advocating for equal justice for Palestinians is the Rachel Corrie Foundation for Peace and Justice. In 2003, Rachel Corrie, a 23-year-old American university student, was crushed to death by an Israeli army bulldozer in Gaza. She was participating in non-violent direct action to stop the demolition of a Palestinian family's home. Since her death, her parents have taken up her cause to foster global peace and human rights. Rachel Corrie's parents, Craig and Cindy Corrie, join me now from Olympia, Washington State. Cindy and Craig Corrie, thank you both so much for being with me. The extraordinary courage, the unflinching commitment to justice for Palestinians that your daughter Rachel showed in her journal, in her letters, her emails and writings from Palestine almost 20 years ago are not the words Americans are used to hearing about this conflict. In fact, here's some of what she wrote in February 2003, just a few weeks before she was killed by an Israeli bulldozer. She wrote this: "Just want to write to my mom and tell her that I'm witnessing this chronic, insidious genocide, and I'm really scared and questioning my fundamental belief in the goodness of human nature. This has to stop. I think it is a good idea for us all to drop everything and devote our lives to making this stop." Do you believe the White House will eventually understand and heed Rachel's call? What will it take?
I think that it's beginning to happen. There has been a tremendous change, growing awareness in the country about what's happening to the Palestinians, not just in moments like we're experiencing now, but really every day. And the humiliation that they live with, the taking of their land, the threat to them in so many ways. And so I think it's beginning to happen. And we've had experience with some who are in high levels of government right now. And we know that they understand this situation. So we're just waiting to hear them speak and act more clearly and dramatically about what the U.S. should do.
But the narrative here in the U.S. is still about both sides, meaning Israel versus Hamas and its rockets. It conveniently forgets the occupation, the subjugation of the Palestinian people for decades now. No mention of the Israeli strikes, the evictions from their homes, the eviction of Palestinians from their homes, the destruction of olive trees, the cutting off of water, of electricity at will. The way the conflict is presented in the US shows Palestinians as the violent aggressors.
I'm 74 years old. This has been going on actually longer than my lifetime. As the state of Israel, it's almost exactly my lifetime. And I think that in the United States, we tend to pay attention when the violence gets obvious, when the bombing that Israel does on Palestinians happens, but we need to be paying attention all of the time. The occupation is incredibly violent. If you're there, as we have been in Sheikh Jarrah, and trying to have tea with a very lovely family, and this is over 10 years ago, and the front half of their house is already occupied by a settler. And listening to him, I think he was from Brooklyn. You know, you recognize the English accent. That's not an eviction. We're talking about ethnic cleansing, and it's been going on my entire lifetime. And as Rachel said, it needs to stop. The White House has been aware since Rachel's killing. We've been in contact with people, and in 2010. For instance, we were talking to Tony Blinken, now the Secretary of State, but then he was an advisor to Vice President Biden. And he told us, as he walked into the room, he said, we can agree on one thing, that the policy in Gaza is a failed policy. And by that, I don't mean that they should have more food. I mean that they should be able to export as well as import. Their students should be able to go abroad to school. Business people should be able to come into the area. They should be having continuous electricity. And he went on to say that list. Cindy looked at him when he was done and said, that's our list. That's why we came here. So when you say, do they know? They absolutely know, and they have known for a long time. When you say, are they going to act? That's a different question.
Cindy, but what will it take to change public opinion to such an extent that it might put pressure on the US administration to have a different approach to this conflict, a less one-sided approach? Because many years ago, Rachel wrote this to you. She said, I thought a lot about what you said on the phone about Palestinian violence not helping the situation. If any of us had our lives and welfare completely strangled, lived with children in a shrinking place where we knew that soldiers and tanks and bulldozers could come for us at any moment, do you think we might try to use somewhat violent means to protect whatever fragments remained? I really think in a similar situation, most people would defend themselves as best they could. I think I would. How did Rachel make you think differently about this conflict? And are more people in the US becoming more sensitized to the plight of Palestinians?
Rachel absolutely brought us to the conflict. When she went there, we started to learn, and she was our mentor. We knew how very much her words mattered to her. She was precise, she was careful. And she started to educate not just her parents and her siblings, but her entire extended family and friends. And I think that her work, but the work of so many others, has continued. And we have changed the discourse here in the United States among the American public. And we've had organizations arise and become much stronger. Jewish Voice for Peace and American Muslims for Palestine, many organizations that are working on this. I think it's powerful these days to see young Palestinians here in the United States speaking out, and now providing some of the most effective voices, I think, in sharing their own stories and their family stories. We have to keep doing the work. We have to be persistent, and we have to work on our representatives in government. And I'm so delighted, really, this week to see that people like Bernie Sanders are speaking out. But even those that have been strong Israeli supporters, Robert Menendez and others, are really challenging what's happening on the ground in Gaza right now. That's important. But what's even maybe more important is that we don't stop. Once this ends, we know at some point, I don't know how many losses there will be, far too many. But at some point, this will stop, and then our job is to keep the discourse going and to make substantive change and to make sure that the language of human rights that the Biden administration has been sharing, that applies to what Israel does, as well as to other countries.
But how do you affect policy change, Craig, beyond these promising and encouraging statements of support that a lot of members of Congress and others have been showing Palestinians and those fighting for justice? How do you confront Israel's impunity? You both filed a lawsuit against the Israeli army for the killing of Rachel. You asked for a symbolic $1 in damages. Yet an Israeli judge dismissed the case, saying it was a regrettable accident. How do you fight and win against Israeli impunity?
I think you just have to keep trying. I think our lawsuit was one avenue, and of course the lawsuit went on actually for years. We were in court, and now it's been so long that I've forgotten, but over and over again. And there was somebody from the U.S. Embassy every day that we were in court listening to that. But we have to put pressure on our Congress and on the White House to look at this, and it is changing. I think political pressure has always been seen as coming from the Israeli side, but that's changing in the United States. Our friends with Jewish Voice for Peace are responsible for some of that. The young people here are seeing this from both sides. It will take a long time. I think the other thing is that we have to congratulate small steps, as Cindy just did. We also have to keep working on this. So BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. We have to be working on that. We have to make sure that nobody criminalizes what, of course, this country started with BDS, with a Tea Party in Boston. It's a great tradition in here. And I think as we look at it, this is a strategy that started or was used with South Africa. And it did not destroy South Africa. In my opinion, it saved South Africa. So we need to keep working on this and working with all of our friends in the United States and our friends in Palestine and actually inside Israel.
The work continues, as you say. There certainly has been some palpable change, the first steps perhaps on the road to real change. Craig and Cindy, Corrie, thank you so much for speaking with me. I know how difficult it is to relive the tragic loss of your daughter, Rachel, but also how important it is to make sure that her legacy lives on and to continue the work that she and so many others have started. Thank you both so much.
Thank you for having us.
Rachel Corrie's death has had a lasting impact. The death of countless nameless Palestinians, less so. It is, of course, expedient for US administrations, past and present, to reduce the Palestinian-Israeli conflict to what it isn't: terrorism by Hamas and before it the PLO that threatens Israel's security and its very existence. The United States' unconditional, blinded support of Israel is repeated ad nauseum. Diplomatic, financial, and military support for a state that is an occupying power under international law. The conflict is not between two equal parties. It is not about religion either. And it is not about Israel's existence or security. It is about justice and human rights. And so, in short, if President Biden wants to bring peace to the Holy Land and live up to his own pledge to put human rights at the core of his foreign policy, foreign occupation, which is a naked violation of basic human rights, will have to be reversed. Imagine for a second if Palestinians were Israelis, living under military occupation and dehumanized for decades by an apartheid system. What would US policy have been then? That's it from me, Ghida Fakhry. Send me your thoughts and comments, but for now, from me and the entire team here in Washington, thanks for watching.